In these first few chapters, there's been a gathering storm, and God hasn't been caught unawares, as we've been saying, but nevertheless, a storm has come, and it is the perfect storm, a holocaust. We're in the days of the Persian Empire, and there is this scattered Jewish minority, and a very powerful man, Haman, has been offended by one of the Jews, Mordecai, and he is now seeking to unleash a holocaust on the whole people, on all the Jews living all around the empire. He is, of course, being used. That's a satanic agenda that is being pursued. Now, as we come to chapter 4 then, this plot, this scheme is suddenly become very, very public. And what we have in chapter 4 in this first verse is Mordecai's instant reaction. Read it already. It is profound and deep grief. He's horror-struck. He collapses. And it seems to me that maybe we need to think about that reaction a little bit. And so what I want to do this morning is to talk about grief, really, and our responses to the great losses that can occur. Now, I want you to realize I'm using that term, grief, very broadly. What I mean is the response of sorrow or fear or anger or numbness that we have to, well, any sort of loss, or even the threat of loss. And although, well, all of us, our minds will go to something specific, but I want you to hold to something much broader. And whether it's the loss of employment or of a relationship, or whether it is bereavement. And I think it would be good for us to think about this reaction and to, well, understand it. And so this gives us an opportunity to do that, and that's what I'm going to try and do this morning. So I've got several things I want to say. The first is I want to point out that grief is a reality. News breaks in this story of all that is about to happen, and Mordecai breaks too. That's just what happens. Now, what do you think? What are you going to say to him? You're going to say, come on, Mordecai, where's your faith? Come on, Mordecai, all things work together for good to them that love God. Pull yourself together, man. Is that the right thing to say? Is that the right thing to do? Maybe there's a temptation as we sit in maybe a comfortable position to say that to Mordecai. But I think it would be a deep mistake and actually a cruel thing to do. And what I want to try and point out is that it's part of our humanity to be shaken when our world is shaken. It's part of our makeup to be upset, to grieve, to lose our footing, to collapse, to fall apart when our world collapses and our world falls apart. Now, I wanted to say that at the very beginning because there is a danger, and it's a danger that is among us as much as among anybody else. A couple of weeks ago, I was preaching about the need to keep calm and carry on. And we talked about some of the tremendous resources there are in this passage and in this book of Esther, in the scriptures generally, that can stabilize us and strengthen us and help us to continue, even in the face of great catastrophe. But the danger is you preach a sermon like that and you come away feeling that, well, it's wrong then to be shaken. And if somehow I can't keep calm and carry on, then in some way I have failed. And there can even be a feeling of guilt adding to our problems of our loss. So let me correct that now. Let me throw this out. Let me hold it up. Let it be heard. Let it be understood. Let it be said. Let it be taken to heart. But keep calm and carry on is a medium to long-term objective. In the short term, being human means being shaken. And actually, if you think about it, by definition, a church is full of people who well, they just can't be fine all the time. The church that is full of people like that is operating in a parallel universe, not in the real world, and people are having to pretend they're okay when they're not really. Because churches are made up of Christians, and Christians by definition are failures. By definition. You can't join this church unless you are saying, I failed. You can't join the church, any church, unless you're ready to say, I'm a sinner. Before you can become a Christian, there has to be that moment of accepting that, of coming to terms with that. And what a Christian is someone who is recognizing that and confessing that and coming empty-handed to God, saying, put me back together again. Saying, deal with my sin, forgive my sins. It's coming empty-handed and asking for grace and mercy. And a church is then made up of people who have received that and who are bit by bit, sometimes quicker, sometimes slower, sometimes one step forward, sometimes 2 or 3 steps back. But it's people who are slowly, by the grace of God, being put back together again. And any strength that we have, it flows from that. And it's hard fought and hard won and often hard to hold on to. So, as we begin, I'm really anxious so that we are able to lift any sense of inadequacy, any sense of guilt, any sense that this shouldn't be in someone who is shaken by a crisis. First point. Second thing I want to say is that grief needs to be expressed. Now, look at what Mordecai does in verse 1. He finds out what's happening. First thing he does is tears his clothes. Then he puts on sackcloth and ashes, out the fire, I suppose, out the stove, and then he goes out into public, wailing loudly, lamenting is the word, and bitterly. That's what he does. Now, what is going on? Well, don't worry, I'm not suggesting that is the biblical standard that we should all pursue, because it isn't. What I'm pointing out is that Mordecai here is doing what people did in his culture, in his world, to express their grief. Now, that is not what this culture does, to express grief. But his culture, they did do that. That's what they did. How do I know that? Well, I know it. Well, you could work it out from the history books, I suspect. Not that I've tried. But I know it because in verse 3, we are told that when news of what was going to happen spread more widely, that all the Jews had the same response. So what Mordecai is doing here in this sort of extreme reaction, extreme to us, is actually not extreme in his world, in his culture. It's what people did. They expressed their grief, and they expressed it in this particular way. Now, my point is not that we should do what Mordecai did in the way he did it, but that expressing your grief, letting it out, is not a bad thing, but a good thing. And actually, more than that it's not just okay to grieve and let it all out, but actually it's necessary and good. Now, this is a bigger subject than you might think. The word wailing loudly in verse 1 is, in our translation, put as a lament. A lament, and that's the better word to translate it. It's an interesting word. It's not just about an outpouring of emotion. In fact, the Bible has a big tradition of lamenting. And there are psalms, whole psalms, that are written to help people lament, that express their sadness, their sense of loss about something. And actually, there's an entire book in the Bible which is all about the same experience, the book of Lamentations. It is a massive, colossal book. Well, it's not that big, but it's a massive, colossal statement about the significance and importance of not just being allowed to grieve, but of finding a way to express it. And so in the Bible, there is a status and significance given to expressing grief. The fact that these psalms and this book exists shows that. But also the form that some of them take. They are poetry. Now, I don't know if you ever tried to write any poetry, but you have to think about it, unless you're amazingly gifted. You have to think about it. And not only that, but some of these psalms, they have a particular form of poetry where you begin every sentence with a different letter of the alphabet. So the first thing you say starts with the letter A, only in Hebrew it's not A. And so you go through. And each verse then is done with a different letter. Now, that's even harder. Try write a poem, but then try and write a poem where every verse starts with a different letter of the alphabet, and you've got to go right the way through. Wow. So my point is this. These people were writing a lament, but it wasn't just an emotional gush that overwhelmed them. No, they sat down. There were people who had written poetry and highly structured ways of expressing your grief. And they were out there in the public domain so that people could have them and use them and benefit from them. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying we should have something similar, although I think I am saying if you're a Christian, you will find those laments helpful. Find them, read them, pray them through. My point is simply to make, the point I want to simply make is that grieving is important. Expressing it is important. It was important here so that people wrote about it and there were things published to help you, complicated things. Now, I'm stressing that because our instinct is to bottle it. It always is, because that's our culture. Bottle it. And I think that's a mistake. I think if you bottle it, you'll just increase the pressure in your own life, and it will find its way out another way, emotionally or physically or relationally or spiritually. There is something about expressing in a culturally appropriate way. It's part of everyday wisdom, isn't it? Have you ever watched Only Fools and Horses? There's an episode there where it's a comedy program, if you're from another culture, and there's an episode there where the grandfather, two brothers living together, their grandfather's been living with them, and the grandfather has passed away. And it's about the aftermath of that. And the older brother, Del Boy, he's, after the funeral, laughing and joking with his friends. But the younger brother, Rodney, he sees his brother laughing, and he's just furious. And he stomps outside. And then another relative, an older man, uncle, can't remember his name, uncle would call him, he comes out and he starts to tell a story to Rodney. He says, I was in the Navy during the war and I used to work in the boiler room. And he says, the most important thing in the boiler room is the release valve, because you get the steam going in the ship, but if you don't hit the release valve and let some of that steam off, the pressure builds and it will blow. And Rodney's going, another boring story about my uncle in the war, being in the Navy. But it's not. Because then suddenly he says, that's what Del Boy's doing. He's letting off steam before he blows. Now that's what I'm saying. We have got to find a way that fits you as a person, fits me as a person, that fits into our culture somehow, where we can not bottle, but share, let off the steam. And so we must find a way. Maybe it's a solitary thing for you. Maybe it is a big public thing for you. Well, knock yourself out. I don't think anybody's going to worry. Do whatever you've got to do. But maybe it's a friend, a confidant that you share with. But find a way. That's what I'm saying. So grief is real. Nothing to be ashamed of. It's appropriate, it's natural, and it needs to be expressed. Now, third thing I want to say. There are two types of grief. We're going to call it good grief and bad grief. Two types. And we need to make sure that the grief that we have in response to whatever loss it is good grief, that it stays as good grief. Now, what's the difference? Well, some people would tell you that bad grief is grief that never goes away. And they would say, look, over time you should move on. I don't know about that. I reject that, I think. I mean, it's okay if you're talking about something that is smaller. But even there, a deep loss will stay with you, won't it? And it's possible to break out into grief and need to express it really right the way through your life. I don't think it's true that you ever move on from it. And I think that's normal and healthy. So I don't think bad grief is grief that stays with you and is still there at some level and breaks out occasionally. No, I think bad grief is something else. I think good grief becomes bad grief when it comes to define us. Now, this is my big idea, so try and stay with this one. Good grief becomes bad grief when it becomes to define us. Now, it can stay with us our whole lives without becoming the story of our lives. But when it becomes the story, that's when we've got a problem. Now, here's Mordecai. Let's go back to him. Here he is, and he is grieving. He's grieving because through his refusal to bow down to Haman, death and destruction is going to land upon his whole nation. Now, that's a pretty big thing to be grieving about. Now, what if Mordecai froze the moment? In verse 1, chapter 4. What if he froze the moment and said to himself, I am Mordecai, the man who brought destruction to his people? What if he'd done that? And what if he took that story? And what if he made that the way he thought about himself? I am Mordecai, who brought destruction on his people. If he did that, if he took hold of that thought, which I don't doubt occurred to him, if he took hold of it and then made it who he was, then I think his grief would have moved from good grief to bad grief. Why? Well, because he would have made it absolute. And what would happen in time is that he would begin to center his life on it. He would begin to find his identity in it. It would come to define him, and it would crush him. So this is what I want to put across to you. That good grief becomes bad grief when we freeze the moment of our loss and the feelings of our loss, and we turn that loss into the story we tell about ourselves. We make it the strapline to our lives, some sort of identity that we embrace. Now let me try and open it out a bit and explain what I mean. And actually at this point we move away from just thinking about loss and grief, and this is relevant to all of our lives in every area. Do you know, we all have a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. So I am Winston Churchill, the great war leader. And I'm sure that in the 50s, after that, that was what he thought about himself. I am the great war leader. That was who I am. Or I am Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. That's sort of a story that is, well, the strapline, the center of everything. Or, what about this, a biblical example? I am Peter. I am Peter, the man who denied the Messiah. Or, if it was just us, I am the person who had this and threw it away. Or, I am the person this happened to, or that happened to. We all have a story, and there may be more than one, but often there's just one. Or it can be dangerous if there's just one that we begin to tell about ourselves. Now, what grief does, or some loss does, or some crisis does, or some failure does, it offers us a new story. That's what this grief is doing to Mordecai. Hey, Mordecai, here's something that you could think about. You're the man who brought disaster on his people. Now, if you embrace that, whatever it is, if you take that story and you say, yes, that is who I am, that's a bad thing. You are embracing, and your good grief will become bad grief. Now, the other thing to realize is that there will always be a tendency for that to happen. Good grief will always tend to decay into bad grief. Why? Well, because our souls, they thirst, and they thirst for something deep and something ultimate, and loss is deep, and it can feel as if it functions at that level, and so there will be something in our souls that will rest upon it. So there are two types of grief: good grief and then bad grief. Bad grief is when it becomes an identity, a story that we tell about ourselves. Now, the last thing I want to say, well, it's a bit of a question really. if all of this is true, and if you're with me in all of this, the question then becomes, well, how do you stop good grief morphing into bad grief? How do you stop it? Well, let's go back to Mordecai. Here's Mordecai. He has done this thing, and it has brought horrendous consequences, and he is devastated. Now, what stopped that becoming the thing that defined Mordecai and destroyed him? What stopped it? See, that's the killer question, isn't it? That's the key. What could stop my loss becoming what defines me and shapes me? What can stop it? That's an urgent question. I tell you what the answer is. Mordecai was not defined by his loss. That didn't become a story that defined him, because Mordecai already had a story that defined him. He already had a sentence that he knew was true about himself. He already had an identity that was at the very core of who he was. How do I know? Well, scroll down to verse 14, and you will see. Here is Mordecai trying to persuade Esther, who's the queen, to stand up for her people and rescue them. And Esther is not ready to do that because it's risking her life. And so Mordecai persuades her like this. He says, "Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape." And he says this, "For if you remain silent at this time," now listen to this, "relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." And do you hear what he said? He said, Esther, you've got to stand up. You've got to stick your neck out above the parapet. You've got to stand up for your people. But if you don't, all is not lost. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Now, where is that coming from? Suddenly he's got a certainty that however it looks, this is not going to be the end of the Jews. Suddenly he has this certainty. It's bubbling up within him. Where's it coming from? Well, I tell you where it's coming from. It's coming from the deepest of stories, that is at the very depths of who he is. You see, Mordecai really is a Jew. He believes in a God who is sovereign over all things, and a God who has made promises to him and to his people, who has promised that through them a Messiah would come, who would bring blessing to all the nations. And any other event that happens, any other story that offers itself to him, well, he takes them on board maybe, and he has to deal with them, and they shake him. But they don't displace, they don't replace this deepest of stories, this knowledge of what we would call the gospel. You see, this is how he can stand. This is how he can stop his good grief from coming to identify and dominate him and define him. Because he knows about the living God who has made a covenant with him and with his people and with the world. And that this God has made promises to save, to bless, to give a future. And he knows that God has promised, well, maybe he didn't know it yet, but we know that God has promised that death will not defeat us, that no crisis will ever end us, that we will rise again, that there is a home in heaven, that there is a day of resurrection, that one day all of God's enemies will be defeated, death, sin, Satan, and all things will be made new. That's the story that defined him. That's who he was. In other words, his thirst for something ultimate was already being quenched by the knowledge of God. And so the story came, the grief came, the loss came, and it wiped him out. But he got up again. And maybe multiple times our loss and grief will bubble up, and we need to deal with it and zoom in on it and express it and handle it. But the thing that will stop us from being defined by it and crushed by it is not by trying to hold it at arm's length and to pretend things aren't as they are, but to recognize that there is a deeper story and to embrace that story. We'll still be shaken. We'll still be grieving, but we won't be defined by it. We'll be defined by the gospel. What I'm trying to say is this. What I am saying is this, I hope. The gospel can keep your grief good. Because the gospel doesn't say, never mind, get over it. The gospel tells us about a Saviour who, before the tomb of Lazarus, burst into tears with anger, frustration, grief. The gospel never says, oh, it doesn't matter. The gospel says this matters, but there's something bigger, there's something greater, and this will not have the last word. Jesus has the last word. So the gospel, it offers us a wonderful story for us to embrace. The story it offers us is, I was lost, but Jesus found me. Or to Peter, who might be tempted to embrace the story, I'm the man who betrayed the Messiah. No, he has a different story. I'm the man Jesus restored. Or Lazarus, I'm the man Jesus raised from the dead. Or Paul, not I'm the man who persecuted Christians and murdered people. No, but I'm the man, and he loved me and gave himself for me. You see, the only story big enough to quench our thirst, to change us for the better, to heal us, to set us free, to restore our souls, is this ultimate story of God, of Jesus Christ, of atonement, of grace, of resurrection, the gospel. So let me end with this. Are you willing with me now for 2 minutes to consider the great love of Jesus for you? Are you willing? Because when he came for you. And he stepped into your shoes. And he lived a righteous life, the only one that has ever been lived. And he lived it for you. And he earned heaven. He fulfilled all righteousness. He earned heaven. And then, having earned heaven, what did he do? He took hell, the cross. He took hell. And he did it as our substitute. Now, there he is on the cross, and he's dying for our sins. He's bearing our guilt. He's setting us free. He's defeating our greatest enemies. He's reconciling us to our God and our Maker so that God can become our Father and we can know forgiveness and adoption and have a future and have a hope and know resurrection. There he is on the cross accomplishing that. Now, freeze that moment and turn that moment into the story you tell about yourself. I am the one Jesus loved. I am the one that Jesus died for. I am the one that Jesus rose for. I am the one the Father saved by grace. I am the one who has a hope and a future in Jesus Christ. Make that the story you tell about yourself. Make that the identity that you embrace. It is the ultimate story. It is the story that is at the center of history. It's at the center of the universe. And it is the great healing story. It is the great liberating story. It is the great life-giving story. And it is your story if you'll receive it. I finish with this. Groundhog Day. You ever watch that? Sorry, this is a change of pace. It's a fantasy film with a very selfish man who's a television presenter. And he's got a co-worker, a very beautiful co-worker who dislikes him. And they go out to film something. And as the film goes on, you suddenly realize this nasty man is reliving the same day. It's a fantasy, it's okay. Reliving the same day. And this goes on and on and on. He is reliving the same day. Always the same day. And there's just hundreds of them. And of course, he can't break out of it. And as the film goes on, well, no, hang on a minute. The day repeats. Grief is like that, isn't it? You relive the same day, same feelings, same questions, same emotions, same loss, over and over again. You can't break out. Well, as the film goes on, the hero, or anti-hero, realizes the only way out is if he can make his co-worker fall in love with him. It's a love story. And so he turns his attention to that. And so now as he lives each day, he has to start with this woman who dislikes him, and in the space of a day he has to get to the point where she loves him. And so there's lots of comedy things happening as he tries to do that. The message of the film? Do they all have messages? When you watch them, look for the messages. The message of the film is love. will set you free. That's what I'm saying. And you don't have to earn this love. It's freely given. The love of Christ, it's vast. It's beating. It's there, the very center of history. It's right in front of you. So big, so immovable. You can miss it. Embrace it. It'll set you free. Embrace it every day. Make it the story you tell about yourself. And I'm going to stop. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we all know what it's like to be stuck in the same experiences and same emotions and same sins and same patterns day after day after day. Whether it be grief, whether it be some addiction, whether it be some doubt, whether it be some fear. Lord, please keep us from making those doubts and fears and addictions the story of our lives. Help us to see that there's a greater story, the story of redemption, of an eternal love, a covenant love. Please help us, Lord. Help us not just to know this, but to embrace it, to come under the umbrella